In Chapter 3, Fulton J. Sheen turns his attention to capitalism, not to issue a blanket condemnation, but to offer a deeply moral and spiritual critique. Writing in the shadow of economic collapse, Sheen acknowledges capitalism's achievements while laying bare its ethical failures. His lens is theological and human-centered. He judges systems not by their output, but by what they do to the soul of man. Sheen begins by clarifying terms. He distinguishes between capital, a necessary part of production, and capitalism, which he defines as an economic structure where capital becomes an end in itself. Too often, capitalism is mistaken for moral good merely because it allows for free enterprise. But Sheen warns against this illusion. Capitalism, unmoored from ethics, becomes a system where profit is idolized and people are commodified. At the heart of his critique is the loss of the moral compass in economic life. In capitalism's modern form, labor becomes servile. The worker is no longer seen as a person with dignity, but as a tool of productivity. Wages become the bare minimum to sustain labor, not a recognition of human worth. Sheen says this is not just an economic failure, it's a spiritual one. He describes a culture in which greed is institutionalized, and those at the top often feel no moral obligation to those at the bottom. One of Sheen's most striking observations is how industrial capitalism strips work of its human character. The craftsman of old took pride in his work. Now, the laborer rarely even sees the finished product. This dehumanization is the cost of mass production, and with it, the loss of joy, identity, and spiritual satisfaction in work. Yet Sheen insists Christianity is not anti-property. The church defends ownership as a natural right, but ownership carries responsibility. In Sheen's view, capitalism can become unjust when ownership is divorced from stewardship, and when the rich forget that property is a trust, not a trophy. What capitalism lacks is not efficiency, but charity and justice, the moral imperatives that give liberty its true meaning. Here, Sheen pivots toward a broader point. The failure of capitalism reflects a failure to understand liberty. True liberty, he writes, is not the freedom to do whatever one pleases, but the freedom to do what one ought. When capitalism promotes unrestrained individualism, it feeds a culture where selfishness becomes virtue and the common good is forgotten. The so-called self-made man becomes a myth that blinds us to interdependence and moral obligation. Sheen doesn't argue for socialism or communism as alternatives. He warns that swinging to those extremes would only replace one form of materialism with another. Instead, he calls for a moral renewal of capitalism, an economy infused with the virtues of justice and charity, guided by religious principles, and centered on the human person, not just production or profit. He ends with urgency and hope. The path forward is not through revolution, but through conversion of hearts, minds, and structures. We must reintroduce conscience into commerce and morality into markets. Otherwise, we risk becoming enslaved to the very systems we built in the name of freedom. Fulton Sheen's critique of capitalism is ultimately a critique of a false liberty, a liberty that separates freedom from truth, wealth from responsibility, and economics from ethics. Decades later, as consumerism and technological detachment intensify, we are still wrestling with the same question. What does it mean to be free? Sheen's answer echoes louder now than ever. We are free only when we choose the good, not just for ourselves, but for one another. It's time for the conversation that ties it all together. If you're in a group Now's the perfect time to grab your review questions and jump right into some awesome discussion. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and let's see what wisdom everyone brings to the table. The real magic happens when we learn from each other.